नमस्कार दोस्तों, मैं हूं सचिन और आपका मेरे YouTube चैनल पे बहुत बहुत स्वागत है। दोस्तों आज हम जो पोइम डिस्कस करने जा रहे हैं उस पोइम का नाम है लिसिडस, जिसे जॉन मिल्टन ने लिखा है। इसे जॉन मिल्टन ने 1637 में लिखा था और ये एक पैस्टरल एलेजी है। ठीक है, फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल इट अपीयर्ड इन 1638 कलेक्शन ऑफ एलेजीज एंटाइटल्ड जस्टा एडवर्डो किंग नोफ्रैगो. So it was dedicated to the memory of Edward King, friend of Milton's at Cambridge, who drowned when his ship sank in the Irish Sea off the coast of Wales in August 1637. जो poem है it is 193 lines in length and it is irregularly rhymed. ठीक है, इसमें से जो कुछ poems हैं वो ग्रीक में हैं और कुछ लैटिन में हैं. ठीक है, Lycidas is one of the poems written in English. Milton republished the poem in 1645 in his collection of the poems. So Lycidas as pastoral elegy. ठीक है, यहाँ पे एडवर्ड किंग को उसने लिसिडास जो है मेंशन किया है एज बाय नेमिंग एडवर्ड किंग लिसिडस. Milton follows the tradition of memorializing a loved one through pastoral poetry, a practice that may be traced from ancient Greek Sicily through Roman culture and into the Christian Middle Ages and early Renaissance. ठीक है, सो यहाँ पे मिल्टन किंग को डिस्क्राइब्स कर रहा है एज सेल्फलेस इवन दो ही वॉज वन ऑफ द क्लर्जी, अ स्टेटमेंट बोथ बोल्ड एंड एट द सेम टाइम कॉन्ट्रोवर्शियल अमंग ले पीपल मीन्स कॉमन पीपल. ठीक है, थ्रू एलेगरी द स्पीकर एक्यूजेज गॉड ऑफ अनजस्टिसली punishing the young selfless king whose premature death ended a career that would have unfolded in stark contrast to the majority of the ministers and bishops of the Church of England, whom the speaker condemns as depraved, materialistic and selfish. चलिए लाइन बाय लाइन पोएम को डिस्कस करते हैं. Yet once more, O ye laurels, and once more ye myrtles brown with ivy never sere, I come to pluck your berries harsh and crude, and with forced fingers rude, shatter your leaves before the mellowing ear. So यहाँ पे the speaker is saying, laurels, myrtles, say what now? The speaker of Lycidas opens his lengthy poem by talking to some flowers. Yep, flowers. He tells them he is again coming to pick their berries and trim their leaves. Okay, so the laurel is a small evergreen tree and it's one of those plants that means something in literature. In fact, it is associated with poetry and with a god named Apollo, who was often depicted wearing a laurel wreath on his head. Why? Well, it all goes back to the story of Apollo and Daphne, so make sure you brush up on your Asian romances. A myrtle is yet another kind of tree. Sere means dry or withered, so we are thinking it's probably evergreen too if the myrtles are never sere. Oh, and rude doesn't mean impolite here, but rather harsh or violent. And mellowing doesn't mean calming down, it means maturing. So the speaker is violently picking the flowers and berries of these trees before they have ripened. In other words, too early. Okay? Now that we have that out of the way, let's take a closer look at these lines. First things first, our speaker doesn't seem too happy. Now, does he? What is his big beef with these trees? They never did anything to hurt him. And speaking of those trees, what's with all the natural imagery going on here? Let's talk rhyme. Did you notice any? We have got the pairing of sere and ear, plus crude and rude. We might have a rhyming pattern going on, but we'll have to read more of the poem to see if we can figure it out. And while we are on the subject of form, we'll go ahead and mention that each of these lines, except for line 3, appears to be in a little something we like to call iambic pentameter. Finally, it's also worth noting that the speaker is using a little something we like to call apostrophe here. Now, we are not talking punctuation, we are talking about the fact that our speaker is speaking to objects that can't speak back, that is trees. Now we'll move on to line number 6, that is, bitter constraint and sad occasion dear compels me to disturb your season due, for Lycidas is dead, dead ere his prime, young Lycidas, and hath not left his peer. Okay, now get it, now we get it. Our speaker's beef with trees is all because of some sad occasion. He is cutting the trees because some sad occasion had befallen. Line 8 tells us that the sad occasion is the death of some guy named Lycidas before, means ire means before, his prime or peak, and that's what is compelling him to pick the berries before their time. Wait a minute, why would a death be a dear occasion? Well, because dear in this instance means hard, grievous, or burdensome. So the occasion is sad and also really tough. Sounds outright. Peer means something similar to what it means nowadays, as in a fellow or equal. According to these lines, Lycidas has died and he hasn't left us with anybody as good as he was. Awesome, we totally get it, right? This guy, Lycidas, has died before his time, and that is what's making the speaker pick the berries before they are ripe. Right? Hold your horses. Does that even make sense? Well, it sorts of does in an elaborately poetic kind of way. He is picking the berries before their prime because Lycidas died before his. It's a metaphor for the death of a young man, ere his prime. Of course, we know by now that Lycidas is a stand in for Milton's dear friend Edward King, who was also a poet and who also died before his time. The poor guy drowned at sea. Make sure you keep these tidbits in mind as you read through the rest of the poem. One more thing before we move on to the next few lines, rhyme. Yep, we still got some of that going on with dear and peer. Plus, dew sounds like a bit rude and crude from the first couple lines. We can call almost rhyme like this slant rhyme. Now we'll read second line, that is who would not sing for Lycidas? He knew himself to sing and build the lofty rhyme. Abandoning the trees for now, the speaker asks us a rhetorical question, as if to say, how could he not write a poem for Lycidas? After all, Lycidas was also a poet, and a pretty good one at that. He willed the lofty rhyme. Singing in English verse is often synonymous with poetry. Remember Apollo? So the speaker is essentially saying that it is impossible not to write a poem about Lycidas, who was not just a poet, but one who wrote in a lofty style. Next line, he must not float upon his watery bier, unwept and welter to the parching wind, without the meed of some melodious tear. First, we are going to go ahead and give you the scoop on some of these more obscure words. Then we can tackle the meaning of these lines. Bier or bier is another word for tomb. Welter is being used as a verb here, and it means tossed or tumbled. Mead means a fitting reward or accompaniment. Phew. Now that we have that out of the way, we can get down to business. According to our speaker, Lycidas must be mourned with the fitting reward of the tears of his friends. And we are not just talking about the salt water that gushes out of our eyes when we are sad. We are talking poetry or some melodious tear. Basically, Lycidas should not remain unwept or unmourned while floating in the ocean, his watery tomb, where he might get tossed round by the wind. Of course, the ocean is not actually a tomb, so we might consider Milton's use of the word bier as a metaphor. Add to that the metaphor of the melodious tear, which represents poetry, and we have got some major comparing going on. Now we will read the next lines, the next stanza, that is, begin then, sisters of the sacred well, that from beneath the seat of Job doth spring, begin and somewhat loudly sweep the string. Sisters? No, not these sisters. Here our speaker is calling on the 9 muses, who were Asian mythical women thought to inspire poetry. As it turns out, the ancient Greek word mosa means poem or song as well as muse. This sacred well to which these sisters belong refers to either Agnipe or Hippocrene, 2 springs that in Greek mythology were thought to be the dwelling places of the muses on Mount Helicon. Here the poet, the speaker, is asking the muses for help in writing his poem for his friend Lycidas. He needs some inspiration pronto, so he is hoping the muses will sweep the string, which is a poetic way of saying play music. This appeal to the muses, called the invocation, is a frequent feature of Western poetry, from Homer through the 19th century. No one likes writer's block. In these lines, the poet strays securely into the world of myth. Our speaker is asking the muses for help, which means we are in a world of imagination and inspiration. We have left the poet's Cambridge home behind. Now I will discuss the next lines, that is, hence with denial vain and coy excuse, so may some gentle muse with lucky words favour my destined urn, and as he passes turn and bid fair peace to my sable shroud. More muse invoking here. Essentially, our speaker is hoping that a gentle muse will help him write. Only instead of asking for help writing a poem about his friend Lycidas, our speaker is hoping that one day when he dies, someone will do the same for him. Now let's break it down. The phrase hence with denial vain and coy excuse is a tough one. That's for sure. The speaker seems to be saying something like, alright, quit being a baby, no more denial and excuses. It's time for me to get cracking on the poem. An urn is a vase that contains a person's ashes, but the speaker is probably just using it here as a metaphor for a grave or tomb. And a shroud is a sheet, usually white, in which a corpse is wrapped. A sable shroud, however, is a black one. This image gives the line a more melancholy, ominous tone. The last two lines are tricky, but our speaker seems to be saying, hopefully some future poet, when he passes by my grave or tomb, he'll say peace be with you or rest in peace. Maybe this poem will help ensure that happens. Now we will discuss the next line, that is, for we were nursed upon the same hill, fed the same flock by fountain, shade and trail. Looks like the speaker and this Lycidas fellow were childhood friends. Nursed upon the same hill is a poetic way of saying that the two of them grew up in the same countryside and tended the same flock of sheep. These two were buddies from the start. By the way, a rill is a small stream or rivulet. Now we will move on. We will read next lines. That is, together both ere the high lawns appeared, under the opening eyelids of the moon, we drove afield. More of the same going on here. The speaker continues to describe his past with Lycidas, saying that they both used to get up before the sun rose to take their sheep out to the fields. High lawns here refers to open spaces between woods, not suburban front yards. There are no kids running through sprinkles here. Of course, these lawns don't appear magically, they just seem to when the sun comes up. When the moon opens its eyes, everything is dark, and suddenly when the sun comes up, a whole world appears. That's a night thought. Oh, and drove refers to the act of driving or moving sheep. Now we will read the next lines. That is, and both together heard, but time the grey fly winds are her sultry horn, battening our flocks with the fresh dews of night, off till the star that rose at evening bright, toward heaven's descent had sloped his westering heel. So, word alert. A grey fly probably refers to any number of insects. Just imagine your standard bug. Sultry does not mean attractive and alluring the way it does today. Nope, it just means hot and toilsome. Remember from the last couple lines that the speaker and his best bud Lycidas would be out before the dawn shepherding their flock. Well, when that morning comes, they hear the sound of this insect, the grey fly, which indicates the sun is up and hot. Apparently, they spend all day out there battering and fattening their flocks on the dew that has accumulated overnight until the star that rose at evening bright starts to set or slope his westering heel. This star our speaker is talking about is probably not a star at all, but the planet Venus, which many folks in the way back days called the evening star. In other words, they used to hear the grey fly for quite some time, even after the evening star had risen and started to descend. What these lines tells us is that Lycidas and our speaker were pretty inseparable. After all, they would spend all day together and even some of the night, tending to their flock. Now we will be reading the next stanza. That is, meanwhile the rural deities were not mute. Meanwhile the rural deities were not mute, tempered to Thornton flute, rough satyrs danced and phones with cloven heel. From the glad sound would not be absent long, and old Demotes loved to hear our song. Here the speaker tells us that he and Lycidas would compose songs or poems, ditties, to the tune of an oaten flute. It is a pipe made from the stem of an oat. Sounds like good times out on the lawn. Various mythological creatures like satyrs and fauns danced along to their tunes. They couldn't resist, not even Demotas. For all you pastoral poetry experts out there, anyone, the name Demotas just might sound familiar. It's a name often used in pastoral poetry for a shepherd, and Virgil, whose work inspired Milton, used it in his eclogues. Tempered means in harmony with or attuned to. Rural deities might be a reference to the type of pastoral poetry found in Lycidas. If we had any doubt before, the mention of satyrs and fauns seals the deal. We have entered into a dreamy mythological world, one that is very different from Milton's real England. Now, next lines. But oh, the heavy change, now thou art gone, and never must return. Alright, Pearl, the time for daydreaming is over. He has undergone a heavy change because Lycidas has passed away. No more frolicking on the lawn, no more voguing with the satyrs. It's time to face a very different kind of music. Note the repetition of now thou art gone. Our speaker can't seem to get over the loss of his friend. He even tops it off with an exclamation mark. Now that's some serious business. Thee, shepherd, thee, the woods and desert capes, with wild thyme and the gadding vine overgrown, and all their echoes moan. Here, our speaker talks to Lycidas directly. So it is an example of apostrophe. The problem is that dude is dead. So he is not actually around to hear our speaker. In talking to Lycidas, he tells him just how much his death has affected the natural world. Even the caves, which are overgrown with wild thyme and gadding vine, and the woods mourn his death. Gadding means wandering or roving. You may have noticed that the structure of these lines is a wee bit tricky. The verb mourn comes in the last line, but its object, the, referring to the shepherd Lycidas, is in the first. In between the object and its verb comes the description of the caves, overgrown with wild thyme, etc. These lines are also an example of personification. The speaker is giving non-human things, like caves and woods, human qualities, in this case, emotions. Next lines. The willows and the hazel copses green shall now no more be seen, fanning their joyous leaves to thy soft lace. Now, it's not just the caves and woods that are bummed out about Lycidas' death. The willows and the hazel trees are down in the dumps too. How do we know those trees are sad? Well, they are not shaking their tail feathers. Oops! We mean leaps to the rhythms of Lycidas' righteous tunes or lays. A lay is a short poem or narrative meant to be sung. Usually it's a synonym for poetry. Now we will discuss the next lines. As killing as the canker to the rose, or tained worm to the weanling herds that graze, or frost to flowers that their gay bard robe wear. When first the white thorn blows, such Lycidas thy loss to shepherd's ear. Yikes, we have got a very complex sentence here. Basically, we can think of these lines as a bunch of similes strung together. Something is as killing as the canker to the rose. A canker is a disease that infests rose plants. That same something is like a tained worm to the weanling herds. A tained worm is an intestinal worm that kills young or weanling calves, pose for use, and finally that same something is as deadly as frost is to blooming, as in wearing their gay wardrobe flowers. What's that something? Lycidas' death? Just in case you are still in the dark. Lycidas' death was very sad to our speaker. Very sad. This sentence of lines is a simile. Except instead of saying Lycidas' death was like, the speaker inverts the order. Now come on to the next lines. Where were ye, nymphs, when the remorseless deep closed over the head of your loved Lycidas? The speaker wonders where the nymphs who supposedly love Lycidas were when he drowned in the ocean, which he calls the remorseless deep. He is addressing these nymphs directly as though he wants to call them out. He is none too pleased with their behavior. Not cool nymphs. Next. For neither were ye playing on the steep where your old wards the famous roots lie, nor on the shaggy top of Mona high, nor yet where Deva spreads her wizard stream. The speaker says the nymphs were not at any of their normal hangouts when Lycidas was drowning. What are these normal hangouts? Well, they should have been on the steep, which refers to a pinnacle or mountain. The phrase old warts, the famous roots, lie tells us that this fountain just might be located on an island called Bardsey off the north coast of Wales. In Milton's time, it was rumored that 20,000 saints were buried there. Druids were priests in the pre-Roman Celtic cultures of Ireland, Wales, England, etc. We don't know much about them, and neither did Milton, but they have become the stuff of legend. In some traditions, they were viewed as priests of Apollo, which explains why Milton related them to the nymphs. And these nymphs were not on the shaggy top of Mona either. No, he's not talking about a bad haircut on a girl. In this case, Mona probably refers to the Isle of Anglesey, an island of the northwest coast of Wales. It was thought to have been inhabited by druids at one point too. Lastly, the nymphs were not near the Deva either. Deva refers to the Dee, a river that runs through Wales and England, and partly marks the border between them. Wizard here means enchanted or magical. Sounds like quite the river. I fondly dream, had ye been there, for what could that have done? Now, the speaker has a habit of being lost in daydreams, only to shake himself out of them when he remembers the cruel fact of Lycidas' death. His use of the explanation shocks us out of our reverie too. After calling out the names for not being where a jolly old Englishman might usually find them, the speaker realizes he shouldn't blame the names. That's just fantasizing. I fondly dream. He seems to think that they wouldn't have been able to do anything even if they had been there, a point he makes by asking another rhetorical question. That is, what could the muse herself that Orpheus bore? What could the muse herself that Orpheus bore, the muse herself for her enchanting son, whom universal nature did lament, when by the rout that made the hideous roar, his gory visage down the stream was sent, down the swift Hebrus to the Lesbian shore. As evidence that the nymphs couldn't have prevented Lycidas' death, the speaker alludes to the story of Orpheus, a poet in Greek mythology whose mother, the muse Calliope, was not able to save him from being dismembered and washed downstream by the rout that made the hideous roar. These lines are tough, but here's a way you might paraphrase them. What could the muse that mothered Orpheus? What could the muse herself do for her son whom nature mourned when his head was sent down the river Hebrus by a group of hooligans who had it out for him? Who were these hooligans? Well, it might help to know some background on this Orpheus dude. Hebrus is the ancient name for a river that runs through modern day Bulgaria, Greek, and Turkey. And Lesbian shore refers to the island of Lesbos, off the coast of Greece. That's a pretty long, complicated allusion, but really, all the speaker is saying here is that if even Calliope couldn't save her own son, why should he expect the muses to have saved Lycidas? Maybe he should cut them some slack. Next, alas, what boots it with incessant care to tend the homely, slighted shepherd's trade and strictly meditate the thankless muse. We have got another explanation to open these lines. A speaker is all kinds of unhappy. Boots here is above, meaning something like to profit or to gain. And incessant is just an older spelling of incessant or without stopping. Essentially, in these lines, the speaker is wondering what he could gain by continuing to live like a shepherd without good old Lycidas by his side and dwelling or strictly meditating on the fact that the muse does not seem interested in helping him out. In other words, she is thankless. We can't help but thinking that he probably doesn't have much to gain at all. The poor guy, what's interesting here? Earlier, when the speaker was describing the shepherd's life, it sounded pretty awesome, right? He and Lycidas frolicked with the fawns and solaced with the satyrs, but now that life seems not so great. In fact, it's homely and slighted, or ugly and ignored. What's the point anymore? Next, he says, were it not better done as others use to sport with amaryllis in the shade or with the tangles of Neaera's hair? In other words, wouldn't it be better to sport with amaryllis and the tangles of Neaera's hair like everyone else, better done as others use? Then think about the muse and live the difficult life of a shepherd. Okay, now we understand the question. What do we actually know what he is asking? It might help to get a little background. Amaryllis is a shepherdess who appears in the work of several Asian pastoral poets, most notably Virgil in the Eclogues and Theocritus in the Idylls. Neaera is another name who pops up in pastoral poetry. She appears in Virgil's Eclogues and the work of several later poets. The tangles of her hair are always mentioned. May we recommend conditioner? Here the poet builds on the idea he introduced in the previous lines. He might have a better time of it if he ditched the shepherd life and took up with some nymphs. Maybe then he could get over the loss of his body. Next he says, fame is the spur that the clear spirit doth raise, that last infirmity of noble mind, to scorn delights and live laborious days. For the past few lines, the speaker has been asking the age-old question, why bother? Now he gives us the answer. The speaker is saying that the only reason we scorn delights like hanging out with Amaryllis and Neaera and live a life of labor is because the prospect of fame spurs on us. Milton has always been a fan of strange syntax, and these lines are no exception. When you read fame is the spur that the clear spirit doth raise, it sounds like the clear spirit is raising the spur of fame, right? Wrong. It actually means that a spur of fame raises the clear spirit. Funky. Basically he is using a metaphor to say that fame promotes the spirit to action, much like a spur promotes a horse to move. Awesome. We have that part down. Now what's this last infirmity of noble mind all about? Well, that phrase modifies fame, which means that fame is something that makes a noble mind sick. If you think about it, that makes perfect sense. If noble people get caught up in trying to be famous, they probably will ignore fun things and focus too hard on their work. Wait, but people become famous now for all kinds of delights, and many famous people have barely done any work at all. True, but in Milton's day, you become famous through your work. Milton wanted to be a very famous poet, so he probably scorned a fair number of delights in his day and focused only on toiling away at the pen. Again, he's continuing the idea he started a few lines ago. Shepherding is no longer the fun it used to be. When Lycidas was around, now it sounds like tough work. But the fair guerdon when we hope to find, and think to burst out into sudden blaze, comes the blind fury with tabard shears and slits the thin spun life. This fame thing is pretty fickle. In fact, it's downright elusive. The speaker continues talking about the elusiveness of fame. When we think we have finally found it, or that our time has come, and think to burst out into sudden blaze, fate comes and kills us. A guerdon is a reward, which means that fame is presented as a reward. The problem is, just when we think we have found that guerdon, blind fury or fate comes to take it away. How does fate rob us of fame? With its shears that can easily through the flimsy or thin spun material that is human life. In other words, just when Lycidas was about to burst out in a sudden blaze, now there's an image of fame. Fate intervened and killed him. Tough break. This blind fury, by the way, is yet another classical allusion to Greek mythology. The fates of which this fury is an example were three female figures who were in charge of determining how long a person would live. The specific fury or fate that our speaker is referring to here is probably Atropos, who was the one in charge of cutting the thread with avowed shears which ended a person's life. Next, but note the praise. Phoebus replied and touched my trembling ears. Enter Apollo, the Greek god of the sun, music, and poetry. Among all kinds of other things, the Greek gods were major multitaskers. In these lines, he is called by his Roman name, that is Phoebus. Phoebus tells the speaker that while the blind fury does destroy human life, she doesn't destroy all the praise we get for our achievements, especially the poetic ones. Right? He says this while touching the speaker on the ears. What's up with that, you ask? Well, it's an allusion to Virgil's eclogues, in which the speaker's ear are touched as well. It's a form of admonishment or scolding. Essentially, Phoebus is telling our Hoth-aided speaker to cool his jets. Next, he says, fame is no plant that grows on mortal soil, nor in the glistening foil, set off to the word, nor in broad. No, set off to the word, nor in broad rumor lies. So, Phoebus describes fame as something that cannot be found in this mortal world, that is, soil, and especially not in one's reputation or rumor. Wait, what? Essentially, Phoebus is telling our guy that fame isn't about how many people on earth know and respect you. Foil here refers to a piece of silver or gold placed under a precious stone to enhance its luster, presumably for display purposes. In this sense, a foil creates an illusion, the same way that looking for fame on earth does. We might think of these lines as a kind of negative metaphor. Fame is not a plant and it's not a foil. Awesome. Wait, what is it then? What lives and spreads aloft by those pure eyes and perfect witness of all judging Job, as he pronounces lastly on each deed of so much fame in heaven, expect thy meat. Phoebus tells the speaker that fame actually lives and grows or spreads aloft as a result of Job's decision. Job has the final word. As he pronounces lastly on each deed, here fame is metaphorically compared to a tree or plant that grows in heaven, provided Job allows it to. Of course. Remember the word meat from line 14? Here it means about the same thing, a fitting reward. The idea here is that Job will give us however much fame in heaven we deserve. Of fountain Aretheus and thou honored flood, smooth sliding Minicus crowned with vocal reeds, that strain I heard was of a higher mood. Phoebus out. Now that Phoebus has finished yammering on, the speaker resumes. Well, speaking, Here in another apostrophe, he addresses the Erytheus and Minycius. For those not in the know, the Erytheus is a fountain on the island of Sicily, and the Minycius is a river or flood that runs through northern Italy. Virgil mentions it in his Eclogues, in which he mentions the river reeds, which our speaker describes as vocal. Our speaker sure has a thing for Virgil, doesn't he? In his address to the fountain and the river, the speaker tells us that Phoebe's speech was of a higher mood, meaning that it was a bit too fancy pants for a pastoral poem. Next he says, "But now my ode proceeds, and listen to the herald of the sea that came in Neptune's plea. He asked the waves and asked the felon winds, what hard mishap hath doomed this gentle swain?" Oat. Is he talking about a piece of grain with ears? Toddling along, listening to the ocean? We wish. No, he's talking about his song, the pastoral poem he's writing. Oat, O-A-T, is a stand-in for a musical instrument made out of an oat stalk, like the oaten reed he mentioned way back in line 33. When he says, "my ode proceeds," the speaker means he is continuing his song. He describes how Triton, the herald of the sea, came in, plea, Neptune, who is the god of the sea, from the charge of Lycidas' death. Milton's friend Mr. King drowned in the ocean, so it makes sense that our speaker might blame the god of the sea for his friend's death. But Triton isn't having it. In fact, Triton wants to understand what went down, too. So he asks the waves and the savage or fallen winds what happened to Lycidas, the gentle swan. Sure, Triton, just blame it on the weather. Why don't you? Next, and questioned every gust of rugged wings that blows from off each peaked promontory, they knew not of his story. And sage Hippotades their answer brings, that not a blast was from his dungeon strayed, the air was calm, and on the lever of brine, sleek Penelope with all her sisters played. This Triton dude is all about getting some answers. He also asked the wings blowing from pointed beaked promontories, a piece of land jutting out into the sea, and they didn't know anything about Lycidas' story. These wings might be a synecdoche for words flying from sea cliffs, or perhaps it's just referring to the wind. Who is this Hippotades guy? Well, that's just another name for Helios, the god of the winds. He kept the winds stored in a cave dungeon and tells the speaker that all of his winds were at home when Lycidas died, so they couldn't have had anything to do with the tragedy. Hippotades also says that the air was calm, and Penelope, one of 50 sea Nereids, was seen playing on the calm level sea or brine. It was that fatal and perfidious bark, built in the eclipse and rigged with curses dark, that sunk so low that sacred head of thine. Perfidious bark? Is there a dog around? Perfidious means deceitful or untrustworthy, and bark is another word for ship. Here, our speaker is saying that the ship is to blame for Lycidas' death, not the winds or the sea. The ship is what sunk so low, that sacred head of thine. In other words, the ship is what drowned you, Lycidas. Eclipses were once considered evil omens, and the speaker implies that because the ship was built during one, it was rigged with curses dark, which caused Lycidas' death. Let that be a lesson, all you shipbuilders out there. Next, Camus, Reverend Sire, went footing slow, his mantle hairy, and his bonnet sedge, inbrowed with figures dim, and on the edge, like to that sanguine flower inscribed with woe, "Oh, who hath reft," quoth he, "my dearest pledge." Camus appears, another word for the river Cam, which runs near Cambridge University, the home of Milton and King. The speaker personifies the river by saying that it is clearly mourning for Lycidas. It is inscribed with woe. He also asks who has taken reft, his dearest pledge. The river wants to know who has taken Lycidas. The speaker goes even further with his personification, describing Kamu as a university student, complete with a furry academic gown, mental hairy, and wearing a bonnet sedge. A sedge is a rush-like plant that grows near water. The bonnet is compared to the sanguine flower, the hyacinth. In Greek mythology, a Spartan youth named Hyacinthus was accidentally killed while playing with Apollo, god of the sun, music, and poetry. According to one myth, hyacinth flowers sprung up from his blood that was spilled. Supposedly, the flower was marked with the Greek word al, which translates to alas, which is a pretty woeful word, if we may say so. Last came and last did go the pilot of the Galilean lake, two messy keys he wore of metals twain, the golden orbs, the iron shirts amain. He shook his mitred locks and stern spake. The pilot of the Galilean lake refers to none other than Saint Peter, one of Jesus' star disciples. In these lines, he appears the last of all the figures that have appeared before our speaker, with the two keys made of two different kinds of metal, and begins to speak. The golden key opens the gates, presumably to heaven, while the iron one shuts them quickly, or Amen. This is a reference to the fact that Saint Peter was the guy in charge upstairs. According to the Bible, he had the keys to the kingdom of heaven. That is from Matthew 16:17-20. A mitre, by the way, is a type of headdress or cap worn by certain religious figures. To have mitre locks means that Peter's hair is stuffed up underneath a mitre, which makes sense when you consider that, according to the Catholic Church, Saint Peter was the first pope. In these lines, the speaker makes a biblical allusion rather than a classical one. It marks a shift in the poem from pagan references to Christian ones. Why do you think our speaker makes this change? Okay. Next he says, "How well could I have sparred for thee, young swain, of such as for their belly's sake creep and intrude and climb into the fold." He speaks. In these lines, Peter begins a speech that is confusing, to say the least. He seems to be saying to the speaker, "How well could I have saved for you, young shepherd? Enough of those guys who break into the fold only to eat, for their belly's sake." In other words, Peter is not a fan of self-interested people who find fame and belonging only for the sake of material gain. Peter could have reserved one of those guys for the speaker to sing about, but he didn't. Based on Milton's note at the beginning of the poem, which claims that the poem will also foretell the ruin of our corrupted clergy, it is clear that the bad shepherds Saint Peter goes on to detail refer to bad religious leaders who don't care about their flocks and care more about fattening their bellies. Of other care they little reckoning make than how to scramble at the shearer's feast and shove away the worthy wooden guest. Saint Peter goes into more detail about these good-for-nothing shepherds. These dudes don't care about anything else. Of other care they little reckoning make, but scrambling for food at the least and forcing out those who were actually invited. Shove away the worthy wooden guest. That shepherding just ain't what it used to be back when Lycidas was around. Blind mouths that scarce themselves know how to hold a sheep hook or have learned aught else the least, thank to the faithful herdsman's art belongs. These guys not only come where they are not wanted, but they don't even know how to hold a sheep hook or do anything else that a shepherd should know how to do. Aught else the least, that to the faithful herdman's art belongs. Shepherd poses not cool. The blind mouths might refer to the fact that they eat without looking or are somehow blindly led by the desire to feed their mouths. Basically, the takeaway point is that the shepherding profession is being overrun by bad dudes. Peter is not happy, and neither, we imagine, is our speaker. What racks at them, but need they are sped, and when they list their lean and fashy songs, grate on their scrannel pipes of wretched straw. These bad shepherds don't even care about their inabilities as shepherds because they have what they want and are perfectly satisfied or sped. When they choose list, they sing weak, bad, and flashy songs. These songs sound terrible and grating when they play them on their squeaky or scrannel pipes. What wretches them means, what business is it of theirs? Peter talks about the faithful herdsman's art. He's saying, why should these no good shepherds even bother caring about the fine art of sheep herding when they are perfectly happy being not so good at it? The hungry sheep look up and are not fed, but swollen with wind and the rank mist they draw, rot inwardly and foul contagion spread. Now, Saint Peter isn't finished, folks. He still has a bone or two to pick. According to him, the sheep look to their inadequate shepherds because they are hungry. They are full, swollen, with wind and mist, but not tasty food like, grass. As a result, they are slowly wasting away and spreading diseases or contagion. Note the word choices here: rank, rot, and foul. These words, in combination with the fact that we have Saint Peter, who literally holds the keys to Christian heaven, saying them, hint at the corruption in the clergy that Milton alludes to in the preface to his poem. Now, besides but the grim wolf with privy paw, daily devours apace and nothing said, but that two-handed engine at the door stands ready to smite once and smite no more. All this loosey shepherding going on is even worse when you add to it the fact that the sheep are already being attacked by wolves on a daily basis. Of course, these lame shepherds don't even say anything about it. Peter also says that some two-handed engine is ready to smite or cut down these bad shepherds for good. Once this engine smites them, he will smile no more, because the job is done. Privy means clandestine, secret, or stealthy. Some critics think that the wolf is a reference to the Roman Catholic Church, which Milton, a radical Protestant, hated. Yep, hated. Return, Alpheus, the dread voice is past, that shung thy streams, return, Sicilian muse, and cool the whales and bid them hither cast. Their wells and florist of 1,000 hues. Now that Peter has finally run out of steam, the speaker pipes up again. He tells Alpheus to come back now that St. Peter's speech is over, or his dread voice is past. We guess Peter's little lecture had driven Alpheus off for a while because he is a river god. The speaker tells us that Alpheus had paced out by saying he had shrunk his streams. Oh, and you might find it interesting that Alpheus is often associated with Artheus, a river the speaker mentions earlier. The speaker also appeals to the Sicilian muse and asks her to tell the winds, whales, to send flowers in all kinds of colors, because the founder of pastoral poetry was a Greek poet from Sicily named Theocritus. Invoking the Sicilian muse means he is invoking the muse that inspired some of the world's very first pastoral poems, those of Theocritus. Alpheus refers to a river and god that is often associated with Artheus, where the speaker talks about this river. In one story, Alpheus fell in love with the nymph Artheus. He pursued her, but Diana, goddess of the hunt and virginity, turned her into a stream before he could catch her. The stream mingled with Alpheus, went underground, and re-emerged in Sicily. We might think of this as the speaker addressing Alpheus as a stand-in for pastoral poetry, as if the poet was saying, "Come back, my pastoral themes, how I have missed you." Ye valleys low where the mild whispers use of shades and wanton winds and gushing brooks, O whose fresh lap the swart stars sparsely look, throw hither all your quaint enamelled eyes, that on the green turf suck the honeyed showers, and purple all the ground with burmal flowers. Our speaker must be a huge fan of addressing non-living things, because we have got another apostrophe here. In these lines, he addresses valleys with beautiful shades, winds, and brooks. He tells them to cast their eyes, throw hither all your quaint enamelled eyes, where he is looking. Awesome, but wait, where's our guy looking? Perhaps toward Lycidas. Whispers refers to a soft, rustling sound, almost like the sound of whispering voices. Use here means go frequently or haunt. The speaker is referring to valleys in which there are often whispers. Now that we have the first couple lines down, let's tackle the more confusing later lines. What's a fresh lap and a swart star, you ask? Well, the word lap can refer to a hollow or a place between hills, kind of like, you guessed it, a valley. The swart star is Sirius, the dog star. According to Homer, Sirius was the canine companion of Orion, a hunter in Greek mythology. When Zeus made Orion into a constellation, he let Sirius join his human master in the stars. Now Sirius, the star, is associated with extreme heat and sometimes a lack of fertility. The word swart means dark in appearance, which is a bit of a strange description when you consider that Sirius is the brightest star in the sky. But maybe our speaker is alluding to the fact that the dog star looks on sparely, which means it doesn't look on very much. In other words, the valley is so fertile the dog star doesn't affect it very much. The speaker is asking these valleys to toss around their quaint enameled eyes, which means he wants these valleys to spread their beautiful many-colored eyes or flowers. These flowers of the valley suck the sweet rainwater or honeyed showers from the green turf and make the ground look purple with spring flowers. What's interesting here is that way back at the beginning of the poem, the speaker did not seem at all interested in having things bloom. Remember, he wanted to pluck all the berries and leaves from the trees before they had a chance to bloom and ripen. But now he's all about flowering. He wants the bird to bloom a lot. Next, bring the rathe primrose that forsaken dies, the tuft crowtoe and pale jessamine, the white pink and the pansy freaked with jet, the glowing violet, the musk rose, and the well-attired woodbine with cowslips wan that hang the pensive head, and every flower that sad embroidery wears. Now let's dig a little deeper into this flower imagery. Shall we? The speaker goes into more detail about these enameled eyes. He tells the valleys to bring the rathe or ripening primrose, the wild hyacinth, which he calls a tuft crowtoe, jasmine, and the pink and the pansy, which we can just think of as generic flowers. That sounds nice and all, but these blooms are freaked with jet, which means they are streaked with black, which is a sign of mourning. He also tells them to bring the violet, the woodbine, and pale wan, cowslips that seem to be hanging their heads. Basically, he is saying, bring every flower that seems to look sad, the ones that wear sad embroidery. It seems like he's okay with blooming as long as that blooming doesn't involve happy flowers. If the flowers look sad, that's fine by him. Bid Amaranthus all his beauty shed, and daffodils fill their cups with tears, to strew the laureate hairs when Lycid lies, where Lycid lies. The speaker continues telling the valleys to ask Amaranthus to shed his beauty and the daffodils to shed tears. We learn that the speaker wants these flowers and all the flowers he mentioned in his earlier lines to decorate Lycidas' coffin. That's where the strew the laureate's hairs part comes in. Because Lycidas was an aspiring poet, his coffin has a laurel on it. While the Amarnath is a real flower, it also refers to a mythical one that supposedly never fades or loses its beauty. It is associated with Eden or paradise, and the fact that the speaker is asking this always beautiful flower to shed its beauty is telling. Don't you think his grief for Lycidas is so extreme that he even wants the Amaranth to show it? For so to interpose a little ease, let our frail thoughts daily with false surmise. The speaker says that he must daily engage with or entertain a false surmise in order to interpose a little ease. What's that all about? Well, the false surmise refers to the act of strewing Lycidas' coffin with all those flowers, because technically there's no hairs. Lycidas' body is somewhere beneath the ocean. Still, he wants to have some sort of ceremonial grieving process to mark the occasion. Thinking about strewing Lycidas' coffin with flowers at least gives our speaker a little taste of solace. Next he says, I me, whilst thee the shores and sounding seas wash far away wherever thy wounds are heard, whether beyond the stormy Hebrides. where thou perhaps under the whelming tide visits the bottom of the monstrous word, or whether thou to our moist was denied, sleepest by the fable of Valorous old, where the great vision of the guarded mount looks toward Nemencos and Biona's hold. Look homeward, angel, now, and melt with ruth, and O ye dolphins, waft the hapless youth. In these tricky lines, the speaker elaborates on the fact that Lycidas' body is missing. This is the beginning of a long and slightly complicated sentence. Don't worry, we'll break it down for you. In fact, we'll go ahead and paraphrase it. While the seas and shores wash your weary far away, wherever your bones are hurled, whether that be beyond the stormy Hebrides, where you might be underneath the ocean and visiting a realm of sea monsters, or whether, despite our tearful prayers, you are sleeping by the table of Valorous, from where one can see Nemecon's and Biona's hold. I want you, angel, to look homewards and feel sad, and dolphins convey Lycidas' body safely home. Phew. Even with impoverished modern English translations, there are still a few places to get tripped up. First, the Hebrides are a group of islands off the coast of Scotland. Whelming means engulfing, and moist woes means tearful prayers. Valorous is a hero that Milton invented in order to explain the word Valerium, a Latin word meaning land's end. In other words, the speaker is saying to Lycidas, whether you are stuck beneath the ocean or resting at land's end, please look homewards. The great vision of the guarded mount refers to a story about how some monks reportedly saw a vision of Saint Michael on Saint Michael's Mount, an island off the southwest coast of England. Vision also means one's line of sight from the top of St. Michael's Mount. So, at land's end or St. Michael's Mount, the line of sight stretches toward Nemencos and Biona's hold. Nemencos is an old name for a region in northwestern Spain, and Biona's hold refers to an old fortress town in western Spain. Both of these places are meant to evoke the threat of Spanish Catholicism. The speaker wants Lycidas to look homeward to England, not Catholic Spain. The angel likely to refers to Lycidas, who appears to be crying with grief, or Ruth. Finally, the speaker asks dolphins to help Lycidas, the hapless or unlucky youth, to drift along. Sailors often thought the sight of dolphins was a good omen. Weep no more, woeful shepherds, weep no more, for Lycidas, your sorrow is not dead, sunk though he be beneath the watery floor. Do you? Things start to turn around for the speaker here. He tells his fellow shepherds to stop weeping, because Lycidas isn't really dead. Even though he has sunk into the ocean, or at least that's what we think he means. But the line, for Lycidas, your sorrow is not dead, can be read two ways. In one interpretation, sorrow modifies Lycidas, as in Lycidas, the man for whom you feel sorrow is not dead. Alternatively, the speaker could be addressing Lycidas himself, saying, Hey Lycidas, your sorrow isn't over, because you are not really dead. Therefore, you are still going to suffer. So sinks the day star in the ocean bed, and yet Anon repairs his drooping head, and tricks his beam, and with new spangled ore flames in the forehead of the morning sky. How can Lycidas not be dead though, if he has sunk beneath the ocean? The speaker gives us a simile to answer that very question. The sun, the day star, appears to sink into the ocean in the west, but it rises the next day, appearing in the morning sky. Maybe Lycidas will rise again too, in just the same way. Anon means right away or very soon. Reappears in line 169 means to reappear or to go again. So each time the sun sinks in the west, it reappears soon enough in the east, where it rises. And when the sun does rise again, he tricks or adorns his beams with new spangled ore or newly sparkling gold. Our speaker personifies the sky here, giving it a human forehead. So Lycidas sunk low but mounted high, through the dear might of him that woke the waves, where other groves and other streams long, with the nectar pure his oozy locks he laves. And here's the unexpressive nuptial song in the blessed kingdoms meek of joy and love. Here's where we get the tail end of the simile that started in the previous lines. Lycidas, like the sun, has sunk but also risen again. Through the power of Jesus Christ, might of him that walked the waves, Lycidas has risen to a place resembling heaven or paradise, blessed kingdoms meek of joy and love. He now spends his time among different groves and streams, and he washes slaves. His slimy, oozy as a result of the ocean, hair, locks with nectar in paradise. Sounds like a pretty sweet deal. While there, he also hears an unexpressive nuptial song. The song is unexpressive because angels can communicate without resorting to speech. The idea here is that, sure, Lycidas has died, but he has also risen to heaven, like the sun rises in the sky, which should be a source of hope and happiness. That's why those woeful shepherds weep no more. There entertain him all the saints above in solemn troops and sweet societies that sing and singing in their glory move and wipe the tears forever from his eyes. Lycidas is definitely in heaven because all the saints are there entertaining him in large, friendly groups that sing, move him, and wipe the tears from his eyes. Not too shabby for our poor shepherd. It could mean that the saints wipe the tears from his eyes so that he never cries ever again, or it could mean that they continually wipe the tears from his eyes as if he is perpetually sad because he is no longer down on earth with his shepherd buddies. Now, Lycidas, the shepherds weep no more, henceforth thou art the genius of the shore. In thy large recompense and shalt be good to all that wander in that perilous flood. Here, our speaker shifts from addressing his fellow VP shepherds to talking to Lycidas directly in another apostrophe. The speaker talks to Lycidas again, noting that the shepherds no longer weep for him and that he is now the genius of the shore. That means that dear old Lycidas will protect all the sailors on the dangerous ocean or perilous flood. In this case, genius doesn't mean someone really smart, but rather a protective deity or spirit, often associated with a particular place. Lycidas has become this spirit, and his particular place is the ocean, where he is now worried. Recompense here means reward. The implications is that becoming a genius is Lycidas' reward for dying. Hey, at least the guy got something out of it. Then, thus sang the uncouth swain to thoughts and rills, while the still morn went out with sandals grey. He touched the tender stops of various skills, with eager thought babbling his Doric lay. The uncouth or unknown swain or shepherd has been singing this whole poem to the oak trees and streams, rills around him. Some other guy has just been reporting that speech to us. Now that's a twist. The swain sang this song while the morning was giving way to the day. He was playing some kind of handmade pipe, touched the tender stops of various skills while singing his rustic pastoral song, Doric lay. Doric refers to a dialect of ancient Greek used by the famous pastoral poets Theocritus, Moschus, and beyond. And now the sun had stretched out all the hills, and now was dropped into the western bay. At last he rose and twitched his mantle blue. Tomorrow to fresh woods and pictures new. The sun has started to set, appearing to sink into the ocean in the west. The swain gets up, touches his mantle or garment, and starts off for new adventures. Fresh woods and pastures new. The phrase stretched out on all the hills presumably means that the setting sun has lengthened the shadows on the hills, creating an image of a lovely, peaceful evening. The poem finishes off on a hopeful note. So friends, finally our poem comes to an end. I know it's been a long lecture, but I wanted to go in detail, and I hope you understand the poem in detail. If you have any question, kindly put it in the comments and I'll try to answer it. Thank you very much for watching the video. Have a great day.